Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Lewis with the Eno Center for Transportation. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Mod Fare Integration for Transit. This webinar is an overview of Eno's newest paper, Mod Fare Integration for Transit, a case study in the Los Angeles and Puget Sound regions. This is the third paper in a research series that we are releasing to examine the FTA Mobility on Demand Sandbox project pilot in the Los Angeles and Puget Sound regions. You can take a look at the full paper and our other papers on Eno's website. They're available for free download. And I mean, one of the reasons why we really wanted to go into this subject is that with private mobility services like TNCs playing a more significant role in many journeys and being more involved in public transit pilots, the landscape of payment systems is growing more complex. And it's not just the need to have integrated payment systems to provide better customer service or seamless travel, but it also plays an important role in reliability, in multimodal trip planning, in tracking ridership and collecting revenue and distributing that revenue. There's a ton of different things that fare integration and fare payment systems play and are involved in a healthy transit system. So in this webinar, we're gonna talk through what it means to integrate fares and how they attempted and were able to do that to some extent in the pilots in LA and Seattle. So with me today, I have two of the paper's authors. First, Romic Aevaz, who is a policy analyst here at Eno. I'm going to turn it over to him in a minute to present some of the report's analysis and findings. We also have Alice Grossman, who was formerly a senior policy analyst here with Eno. She recently got a pretty nice gig over at AAAS as a Science and Technology Policy Fellow. And while we miss having her on staff, it's a really neat opportunity, and we're really happy that she was able to come back and help us out with this webinar. So. Like I said, I'm going to disappear for a minute and turn it over to Romic. But before I do that, for those on the call, we would encourage you to type your questions that you have into the chat function or the questions function, the questions function on the GoToWebinar control panel. After the presentation, I will be asking those questions to the two paper authors, and we'll have a good discussion before we wrap up in about 30 minutes. So with that, I'll turn it over to Romic.
Thanks, Paul. As Paul mentioned, I'm Romic Aevaz. I'm a policy analyst at the Eno Center for Transportation. And I'll start off by providing a brief overview of the Mod Sandbox pilot and a bit of a background on fare systems and the history of fare integration and why agencies and transportation providers would pursue integration both with other agencies and with other third-party providers. Next slide, please. So the Federal Mobility on Demand Sandbox program was launched in May 2016. The FTA announced that $8 million in funding was made available for agencies to test new ways to encourage multimodal, integrated, automated and accessible connected transportation. Among the key features of the program is a focus on local partnerships and demonstrated solutions in real world settings. And as you are probably familiar with our past reports, Eno is part of the research team evaluating the $1.3 million partnership between Los Angeles and the Puget agencies in Los Angeles and Puget Sound with via a transportation network company and an MOD provider to provide first mile, last mile connections to and from certain select transit stations. Next slide. And part of the one of the stated goals of the MOD pilot was to provide fare integration between the agencies and the MOD provider. Specifically so that lower income riders and the unbanked would be able to use their existing fare cards and options on these new services. So I wanted to briefly start off by just providing a, kind of a high-level overview of fare systems. And so this chart is by no means prescriptive and, hierarchical, but it serves to kind of capture, some of the big pieces of what goes into a fare system. So of course, fare system, entails, everything, both hardware, software, pricing, tickets, products, anything that, goes into how an agency collects fares, how it sets fares, what those fares are, and, what options exist for riders. So at the high level, agencies have, a fare policy. This can be a informal, guidance and principle, or it can be something that's formally, written. Perhaps an agency is required to, has a mandatory fare box recovery ratio, and, therefore, they'll have a formal fare policy that sets fares accordingly so that they can, capture that fare revenue. Or perhaps, there's, changing economic conditions, rider demographics, equity considerations. These types of things can guide an agency's fare policy. And so a fare policy guides how an agency is going to set its pricing, whether or not it, has free fares or charges for fares, how it's going to go about procuring fare collection hardware and software, and how it manages fare collection. How do you handle that data? How do you protect that data? Who processes it? Are you working with other agencies to collect fare revenue? And if so, how is that collection managed between any partners, that may be part of that fare collection system? And so that policy is kind of the overarching, guidance that determines an agency's fares. And so you can see, in the yellow orange below, underneath that, you kind of have two broad components: fare structure and fare technology. So agency's fare structure, of course, entails things like the fare strategy. Are you going to have a flat fare of, $2, $3 across bus and rail? Are you going to have different fares for different modes? Are you going to have free transfers, or are riders going to have to pay a fee or a set price to transfer between bus and rail, or between certain routes? Fare payment. So are you going to offer riders the option to purchase a single ticket or a set of tickets? Can they purchase a pass for 5 days or 7 days? Are you offering the option for riders to store value, either on their account or, on a fare card? And then of course, fare pricing. How much are fares going to cost? How much is the pass going to cost? Do students, do seniors, do they receive discounted fares? All of those, elements fall under the umbrella of fare structure. And on the side of fare technology, you have things like fare collection. Do you have turnstiles at the subway stations? Do you pay when you board, and do you have card readers, at the front and the back of the bus? Does the conductor have to validate your ticket, or do you just have to flash, a screen on your phone that shows that you've purchased a ticket? And lastly, fare media. When you purchase a fare product, is that a paper ticket? Is that a reusable swipe card? Is that a tap card? Do you allow for mobile ticketing or mobile payment? Or do you allow riders to just tap or swipe their credit card on board? So all of these things are connected. These are not necessarily hierarchical. So an agency's fare technology might inform, how it sets up its fare structure, and vice versa. Next slide. So this chart shows, traditionally, the different types of fare collection based on mode. And so you can see, for example, heavy rail and subways typically utilize barriers and proof of payment. And so you have to, if asked, present your ticket, or if you're on a commuter rail, you might have, the conductor come and validate the ticket. And so one thing you'll notice is that, MOD services and app-based fare collection methods are missing from this chart. We've seen a emergence of new app-based modes and services, which has led agencies to consider, how are we going to collect fares on new modes if we're partnering with a mobility on-demand provider? How can riders pay a fare for that service? And as more people use, third-party trip planning apps or ride-hailing apps that are starting to integrate, transit schedules into those apps, are riders able to purchase a fare through a third-party app? Next slide. And so that brings us to the question of fare integration. And so we've seen, over the past years, agencies have moved away from, the old school method of using tokens, and now we have swipe cards and tap cards. And you are starting to see agencies, move away from, fragmented systems where you have to pay fares to multiple agencies or to the bus provider or the commuter rail provider, and really starting to look at how fares can be integrated across providers. So there are a couple of ways that agencies can pursue fare integration. You can have regionally integrated fare payment systems. So instead of having to pay a fare when you board the bus and then transfer to the commuter rail and then transfer to the subway, you can just pay, a single regional fare that could either be in the form of a pass or, perhaps the agencies have partnered together and they have a shared hardware and software and a revenue sharing agreement so that all of that on the back end gets processed. And, you don't have to have 3 separate fare collection systems. You might have regional fare media. So, here in Washington, D.C., the smart trip cards and the charm cards can be used on the metro, on the bus, on the circulator in Baltimore. And so you have a regional fare media that's accepted across, multiple providers, both, commuter services, and your local bus and heavy rail services. And the last one is the focus of this particular webinar, and it's the newest and perhaps one of the ones that are a little bit more challenging, and that's collecting fares through third-party apps. And that allows riders to buy tickets or fares through a third-party app. So, for example, the transit app that many of us might use to plan our trips. You might be able to plan your trip and purchase a ticket directly through that app. Or if you're using Uber or Lyft, you might have the option of being able to buy your train ticket in the app. Next slide. And so the purpose of fare integration is to enhance the rider experience, simplify transfers. In many cases, studies have shown that this can increase ridership, improve accessibility of transit services, particularly if you ensure that whatever fare media that you use can be refilled at multiple locations with cash, or allowing the use of prepaid cards or debit cards. It'll give more people access to these services if you make it easy to pay and you don't have to pay several times, especially if you're transferring. And lastly, tracking travel behavior across transit systems. So when you have a fare collection system in place, you're collecting data on riders, and you can see how people are using the system. And as I mentioned, the pilots in LA and Puget Sound incorporated fare integration as one of their goals. Next slide. So just to quickly talk through 2 recent examples of fare integration. Ventra in Chicago in 2013, it's both an account-based and an open payment system, which means that you can have a Ventra account and you can load value on your card, you can purchase tickets, you can purchase passes, or you can just pay with your debit card or credit card. And so Ventra is a partnership, and it currently incorporates the CTA, PACE, and Metra. So that's the heavy rail, the commuter bus, and the commuter rail services. And it's set up to be open payment, and so kind of open-ended, and so you can incorporate new providers, at any given time. And in fact, Chicago is currently also a recipient of an Mod Sandbox grant, and one of their pilot efforts is to incorporate Bikeshare Payment into Ventra. And so you can pay for your bike share with your Ventra card, and if you open your Ventra app, you can see where the bike shares are and pay directly. So Ventra is an example of regionally integrated systems. So instead of having to pay fares to the CTA, pay fares to PACE, pay a separate fare to Metra, you can use one card, whether or not you have a Ventra account. Next slide. One of the recent examples of third-party fare integration, is the Denver region, and so RTD has partnered with Masabi, a fare collection firm, and they've launched a fare payment platform that's allowed them to integrate with 2 third-party apps, Uber and Transit, which is the trip planning app. And so riders are able to not only, of course, look at the fare schedules and look at when trains and buses are coming in both of those apps, but they can actually purchase passes and fares. And so this is one of the newer examples of third-party fare integration. We've seen a handful of these pop up across the country, and it's currently a work in progress, but this is just an example of how that works. And the this was made possible by the fair payment platform that the agencies adopted that allowed them to integrate with these third-party apps and their APIs and their platforms on the back end. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Alice, who will talk through how Los Angeles and the Puget Sound regions were able to attempt fair integration and how that worked out on their end. So Alice, take it away.
Great, thank you, Paul and Romic, and it's great to be back on an webinar. So I'm just going to follow up and go into some of the details about how this project worked in Los Angeles and Puget Sound, and what they were and weren't able to achieve with the fair integration efforts, and what some of the challenges and successes along the way were. So it ended up working fairly differently, even though this was one project under the MOD Sandbox that was implemented in both Los Angeles and Puget Sound regions, due to differences in the fare structures and the fare media and the agency structures and the payment structures. Both regions sort of came up with their own way to do different types of light integration with the fare payment. So I'm going to start off by talking about the Puget Sound Seattle region. So those of you who are less familiar, they use a fare media, they use an ORCA card. And so both Puget Sound and Los Angeles are also in the process of changing over from a card-based system to an account-based system. So this added an extra level of challenge and difficulty to the MOD Sandbox program, because as the sort of the innovation and first mile, last mile, and pilot parts of the agencies were trying to move forward with their goals of fair integration for the MOD Sandbox project. At the same time, there was a whole transition happening in, well, there still is a transition happening in the fair payment area of the transit agencies. So it called for a lot of communication within the agencies, as well as between the transit agencies and via, and then of course with the public as well. So in Puget Sound, they use the ORCA card, which is a one regional card for all, and it's accepted by 7 different agencies in the region. So regardless on if you're getting the bus, or if you're getting on a Sound Transit light rail, or if you're getting on ferry, you can use your ORCA card. So they've been able to get this sort of regional integration already through the card system, and moving to an account-based system is just going to enhance a lot of what they've been able to do and open up even more options, some of which Romic already talked about in Chicago with the Ventra system, so I don't need to go over that again. And so when they were trying to do integration in Puget Sound, they wanted to use the ORCA card because this is what was already integrated with all of the different agencies and what their transit riders were familiar with. So one of the things that you want to do, can you please go to the next slide, Madeline? Sorry. Thank you. One of the things that they wanted to do was both make the new project, which is the first mile, last mile via to transit stations, accessible to existing transit riders, but also accessible to new riders. So being able to add this service for existing transit riders, but maybe also attracting new riders by giving them this extra amount of access. So that meant not only using the ORCA card, but also looking for other options. And another goal of this pilot, beyond the fare integration, which Romic mentioned at the beginning, is they also wanted to try to increase equitable access to transit. And that includes looking at populations that are unbanked and underbanked. And so especially if they don't already have an ORCA card, this meant looking for other ways of payment. And so they were able to do that by including also the mobile payment option, and then also a credit or debit or prepaid card option, which they were not able to do with ORCA readers, but were able to do through the VIA app. So in the end, the transit agencies worked with VIA, and they were able to accept ORCA payments and mobile payments with ORCA readers, and they were able to accept the credit, debit, and prepaid through the VIA app, which resulted in this slightly confusing fare payment system that you see here on this slide. So if you were paying through the VIA app, then those payments would go straight to VIA. If you were paying for the ORCA card, it was going through the agencies, and then they were going to have to reevaluate that at our paper on in procurement, you'll see a very detailed explanation of this system, both in the Puget Sound region and the Los Angeles region. Slide, please. So they faced many successes and challenges moving forward. There was a lofty goal. Can you go to the next slide, please, Madeline? I'm not seeing a slide change, but hopefully you guys are. Excellent. Now I do. Great. So there were a number of challenges. Oh, we're still on successes and challenges. Excellent. Perfect. Faced within the region. And setting up this goal in both regions of trying to get as much fair integration as possible for the ease of the agencies and VIA and the users was great. And they didn't completely reach the end, but moving forward with the new types of fair payment systems, we're going to be able to see lots of other new options with these types of programs and projects moving forward as well. And we learned some lessons in this pilot that we're going to be able to apply. So at the beginning, there was a delayed ability to accept credit, debit, and prepaid card payments. And this was due to a local policy around credit card readers. And so in this case, it was sort of there's this local King County policy that has to do with being able to only use the credit or debit readers that have already been accepted. So the agencies ended up being able to get an exemption through that to be able to allow what was very important to them, which is this sort of extra option to be able to pay for people who might be under or unbanked. There was also the problem of just being able to pay with the Orca cards to begin with. Not that easy when you've got a new fleet of vehicles coming in. You know, if you're riding on the bus or an existing or a light rail or a train, in Puget Sound, they already have the fare collection system set up, but they had to work with VIA, and in the end, they were able to find a model where they had a dedicated fleet of vehicles, and they were able to find portable fare transaction processors, which can read Orca cards. They're existing technologies an existing technology that can read Orca cards. They were able to put those into the vehicles. This would not normally be particularly easy necessarily, and had they went with a model more similar to in LA, where the contractor drivers were bringing their own vehicles, this probably wouldn't have been possible. So it had to do with the specific model in the specific region as to how they could go around the fare collection process. Now, the PFTPs were able to then easily read the Orca cards and accept fare payment that way. But unfortunately, they were also fairly difficult to work with. So they provided both this opportunity for ease of fare collection, but then also this challenge of working with a technology that is old, in low supply. They really had to work to find enough readers and keep them working as much as possible. They're very sensitive, and also they are not made anymore. So it is a really valuable asset to the agencies, and the fact that they had this trust with VIA and were able to train drivers and have this dedicated fleet to be able to keep track of the readers was very important to the agencies, because they really are, in that sense, a priceless asset to the agencies in regard to thinking about fare payment and fare structure. By using the Orca card and the Orca readers, they were able to achieve free transfers and able to give people reduced fares who qualified for reduced fares. So people who had youth cards, for example, or senior cards were able to get the same discounts that they do on King County Metro rides or Sound Transit rides as well. And the other benefit that we get with the Orca data set is an incredibly robust travel behavior data collection. So being able to link the Orca card number and see how individual users are traveling through the system, and when they're using the VIA pilot and when they're not using the VIA pilot, how travel behavior has changed over time, how it changes over space, and how it changes based on different users, was really able to help us as a research team to be able to analyze this project, which was really one of the main goals, is being able to answer the questions and see if the agencies reached their goals for this pilot. So that was a huge benefit to the system that they came up with in the end. And unfortunately, with the credit card and debit card and prepaid cards, we didn't get the same amount of data, but they were actually very lowly utilized as a payment system, but it's also still important to have that option for all of your users. Next slide. So in the Los Angeles region, they also had a card-based system moving into this pilot, which is the TAP card. That's their regional card that can also be used on multiple transit all across LA County. So they're also fairly familiar with this idea of trying to integrate a similar payment method and media in multiple different agencies. But again, it's always different when you're bringing in a private service and in the specific pilot context. So the LA Metro team at TAP was undergoing a transition from a card-based system to an account-based system at the same time as the pilot was getting underway, similar to in Seattle. And so there was a lot of communication between the Office of Extraordinary Innovation and the TAP office to be able to provide the best integration possible. Next slide, please. This integration ended up being partially realized, and LA Metro was able to sort of just default to VIA since they didn't have this advantage of the dedicated fleet that Puget Sound did. They used the VIA app to collect fares. And to be able to collect some of that travel behavior data, they also had riders entering their TAP card number into the app. And so this allowed users who already had the TAP fare to be able to also get those reduced fares. They created some lookup tables so that we could connect the TAP numbers to the users. So people who qualified for reduced fares were able to get those. And it also meant that we were able to look at the travel behavior, which was great, and provide the free transfers, which was also important. VIA made the decision a few months after launch, very shortly after the launch of the pilot, to actually eliminate the fares. And this was partially in hopes to help attract riders and create a system that was easy to use and free for everybody. So this kind of threw all of that fare integration work out the window in a way because everything ended up being free, but there were also a lot of valuable lessons learned, and it enabled the agencies to sort of start this pilot with a light integration that ended up working for them. They also removed the TAP numbers from the VIA app when they went free to really create this ease of use for the riders, so people wouldn't have to put their TAP cards in, and that there would be a trust that they weren't going to be charged for these rides after. So that had positives and negatives as well, because you're losing that travel behavior data, but you are creating an easier system for the users. So I'm actually going to skip ahead. I think I went through a lot of the successes and challenges in the last couple of slides. Increase in equity for access, good lessons for future integration, a lot of conversations along the way, but in the name of time, I'm going to go right ahead to the recommendations. Let's skip ahead. Excellent. Thank you. Based off of what we saw in Puget Sound and what we saw in LA and a lot of the other examples and background work that we looked into. And so that is prioritizing project goals is really important. Fare integration was one of 3 project goals, and it was not the most important goal. The most important goals were looking at how we could provide cost-effective equal access for individuals who might be on or underbanked, who might have disabilities, who might have other things that make different mobility options work better or worse for them. And so that was a goal that we really prioritized. And then also just learning from how TNCs and transit agencies can work together to provide this first mile, last mile solution. So prioritizing your project goals means that you're able to reach the goals you want to, and both regions were able to find a sort of fair payment and integration system that ended up working for them in the end. So that was very important that we were able to use our resources wisely. Using the benefits of positive partnerships, if you go back again to our contracting paper and our data sharing paper related to this project, you'll see that there were months and months and months of conversation. There were term sheets drawn up, there were contracts drawn up, there were data management plans drawn up, and having all of this conversation and a lot of transparency between the public and the private sector in this partnership, as long as with us as the researchers, enabled a positive relationship between all involved. So that included, in the Puget Sound region, being able to put these fare card readers into the VIA vehicles, which ended up being a very important part of how they did their fare collection system. It was really based on trust and positive partnerships. Being adaptable was also very important. In both regions, the fare payment and the fare integration changed over time. It will continue to change And that actually relates to the next bullet point, coordinating early and often with the agency staff responsible for fare collection and media. So as the fare collection and media are overgoing these transitions from card-based to account-based, we're going to see changes, and having that coordination between the different areas internally in the agency really allows all of that to move forward smoothly and in the best possible outcome for the users in the end as well. Recognizing the utility of the fare payment data is always a trade-off, data collection and the costs and utilities associated with that, both for the agencies and the users. So always something to take into account. There's the positives of being able to do studies, but also think about, what does that mean for the system and the users? And then also considering fare-free and free transfer options. Fare-free transit is a huge balloon that I'm not going to open right now, but getting those free transfers in is very important to make transit accessible and attractive to the riders. And so thinking about when you're mixing modes and agencies and private companies, how you really can come up with a system that works best for all people. So hopefully we can take a couple minutes extra for questions, and let's turn it back to Paul for that.
All right, Alice, thank you. Romic, thank you as well for giving a synopsis of the paper. I know that there's a lot in there, and we are technically out of time for the webinar, but we do have a couple questions that have come in, some clarifying ones. There are a few folks that we'll be replying to after this, but just a few things for clarification, because these questions came up a couple times. And one is, so someone's asking, does fare integration require any coordination or approval with state, federal, or local governments? Or is it just the agencies that control fare policy? And my understanding that it's just agencies, but is there a role here for federal, state, local governments?
It really depends on the state.
Example. Oh, go ahead, Romic.
And go ahead. I was just saying it really depends on the state and locality, if there's any regulations on procurement or third-party vendors. But Alice, go ahead. There's no overarching, to my knowledge.
One example would be in the Puget Sound region. There are policies at King County Metro around the credit card payment processors. And so to be able to collect the fares through that type of media, they did have to look at the local policies. So I think generally it's agency based, but it's important to check state, city, county policies. And also in the Seattle region, there's the joint board, the governing board for ORCA. So they've even created this extra level of policy and governance for their fare payment that isn't directly at an agency, but it's a separate entity.
Got it. And then another question that's come up a couple times is the term underbanked. I think a couple people have heard of unbanked, but what do we actually mean by underbanked, and how would we define that? Alice.
I am not a strict definition for that, because I think that there are multiple viable definitions, and this is not an area that I am an expert in. But you can think about how different people have different levels of banks, and there are different types of banks. So if somebody has a credit union account, for example, that's going to be very different than somebody with a checking and a savings account at a major bank, and figuring out the different ways that you can load value onto different fare media or use different types of fare payment options will depend on all of those different elements of being banked. But that's something I would go to an expert in the field on some more specific definitions.
Some questions, a couple questions about the future of cash, right? And I think we touched on this a little bit in the cases, but obviously there's a certain portion that like and still do pay in cash on buses and for other things. But with this kind of service, is there a future for cash in transit systems, or are there going to be enough options that it will be equitable? Let's go to Romic and then Alice, if you have any thoughts on it.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's a debate playing out in terms of how you move ahead. There is probably an assumption, for some people that modernizing fares necessarily means getting rid of cash, but it doesn't have to be the case. You can definitely have modern fare payment systems and still be able to accept cash. And I think when we're talking about serving the unbanked and underbanked, being able to still refill, your card with cash at, gas stations, convenience stores, multiple places, I think there's still a room for that. I mean, you can look at, at Ramada, just recently we debuted Apple Pay and mobile payment, but they didn't necessarily, get rid of the cash option. And so I think there's room there so long as agencies prioritize it. But it's a matter of, putting in that priority and that effort.
Yeah, I agree with Romic. There absolutely are equity considerations, but there's also cost considerations of collecting cash, and you see agencies moving in different ways right now. And I'm not sure if there are any studies out showing that some of the agencies that have gone to cashless, sort of what the implications have been. But I do recommend that everybody looks back in the webinar history at enotrans.org, and there's a fabulous one from some experts in Minnesota where they were looking at people access to transit and transportation options in Minneapolis, specifically walking through with a gentleman who was unbanked at the time, and they go through some of the different hurdles of accepting different types of payment options and what that means for riders.
Got it. And so I think that'll wrap up the questions for today. I will say there's a bunch we didn't get to. Some of them we're going to follow up with you directly. In other cases, these questions will be answered in some forthcoming reports. We're going to be releasing 2 reports this fall. One looking at how these pilots addressed ADA concerns and needs for those folks. And then also a broader data analysis that's looking at how the pilots actually performed and some recommendations about mod pilots in general. So please tune into those webinars when they come up in a couple weeks. And again, thank you to Romic and to Alice for joining us today. And thanks to everybody for joining the webinar this afternoon.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, guys.